Ladies and gentlemen, please make yourself comfortable and welcome to the stage Mr. Andy Edwards with his ranking of the 1980s albums by Miles Davis. Thank you. But I can't be asked, I put my big red screen up here in the bedroom. I'm looking out over the cars travelling past, and I can make a video. And I literally am dressed here, but I'm not dressed. I'm not nude. You know, I'm not nude, but I'm not dressed down below. I've got my pyjama bottoms on. That's what we're dealing with today. And the reason is because I'll tell you what happened this morning. I was thinking about the Rubber Band album that was brought out posthumously. We get there in the end. Posthumously. God, is this a good way to start? So we just start again, right?
Okay, so this is awesome. This door is going to do an impression of Miles Davis' Bitches Brew. Stand by. Okay, ready? Miles Davis. Money.
Ladies and gentlemen, bloody hell. This is what happens when you just do when you've got out of bed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this video. On this video, I'm going to be ranking the albums of Miles Davis. Not all the albums, just the albums he made in the 1980s. A period that's quite troublesome for many people. A period that does not represent Miles Davis for many people. But a period of music that was very important to me as I was growing up listening to jazz at the time. And Miles Davis being such a superstar at that time, I went and bought every album as they came out. One album I didn't buy, however, was the album Rubber Band, which was released posthumously in, I think, 2019, and collected a bunch of sessions together from 1985, a period which probably exemplifies the sort of worst in terms of what people who don't like the 80s Miles think is the worst, right? And it got mixed reviews, and because it got mixed reviews, I never listened to it. Now this morning I get up, I'll put it on Instagram, and the great Jason Marsalis, who's been on this channel twice, who was saying, you know, if somebody says an album's no good, don't you take their word for it. I thought, he's bloody right. And the example he gave was On the Corner. He said, I had a friend who everyone said, don't listen to On the Corner because it's rubbish. And then when they actually listened to it, it was absolutely bloody brilliant, because On the Corner is absolutely bloody brilliant. And he was regretted missing out on it. And so I went and listened to Rubber Band. And I had exactly the same thing. I thought, this is bloody great. This is amazing stuff on here. And then I thought, oh, well, that would change my assessment of 80s Miles hearing this, because it's a missing link, I suppose, between the early 80s fusion albums with Mike Stern and Schofield on, which I think people like a little bit more than the later ones, where the sort of tutus and mandlas, where it's a lot more closer to pop music. And this album sort of sits in between the two, doesn't it? Anyway, on this, I'm going to go through rank the albums from 10 to 1. I've done this before, actually, and if you want to go back, certain albums, you will find that I have spoken about more in the past. So what I'm going to do here is actually focus on the ones that I haven't spoken about that much, because my ranking has changed, actually, through going back in and listening to them. So with 3 minutes in, that's my introduction. I've given you all the caveats. They're called caveats, though. The caveats, people don't like the caveats. They like to get straight into the top 10, but they don't understand the amount of criticism I'm under doing these. So I have to make sure I've got caveats at the start. So when people start to criticize me and say, you didn't talk about that album enough or whatever, I've got a caveat. All right, but my problem is I'm from the West Midlands, so I talk a lot. You know, go and check out Kevin Turvey by Rick Mail. That Kevin Turvey is basically a parody of me. And if you listen to Kevin Turvey, he just goes on and on. This is the thing that happens in the West Midlands. It's not because I like the sound of my own voice, right? It's because I'm from the West Midlands in the United Kingdom. Kevin Turvey, go and check him out. Certain people watching this of a certain age are just going, yes, Andy mentioned Kevin Turvey. I never expected Kevin Turvey to crop up on a video about Miles Davis. And that's the whole point why I do the channel. And that's why I do it, so we can get those links together between the Turveys and the Davises. Right, shall we start up? So on this list, you haven't finished with the caveats. You got with your basic caveats. On this list, I haven't really considered the albums from the 90s because it's from the 80s. That would be Doo Bop. It would be the Quincy Jones Live at Montreux albums. I wouldn't even put them in the list of a top 10 anyway. They would not be in the top 10. I've also not put in the soundtrack albums to Siesta and Dingo, which are good, but I just thought it would gloss over the sort of Miles Davis albums where he's playing jazz rock fusion. They're a little bit more orchestral, and Siesta's got more of a Spanishy sound to it, and the other one hasn't. Dingo hasn't anyway. I haven't really listened to those that much. That's why they're really not on the list. Be honest, Andy. Just be honest and tell them. I have listened to them. Siesta I've listened to more than Dingo. You're just showing off the fact that now you can go off on a tangent, aren't you? What you've done is you've come up on here, you've done your rubbish start just to show them that actually doing a YouTube video is quite difficult and the concentration that's required to talk like this at this speed without going wrong. And then you've girded your loins, haven't you? Girded them. You've done some girding, you've girded your loins, and then you've come out showing what you really can do. You're just showing off your virtuosity now. I mean, you're not even taking a breath, it's just flowing out of you. There's no edits. There's none of that thing where someone's up like that and then suddenly they're right up close and they're like that, you know. When you do that, your fans don't like it. You gotta get messages. Don't do that, Andy. Just raw. Just get up on camera, switch the camera on, and get going. And let's get going on this list of the top 10. Not, you know, Miles Davis albums for the 90s. It's not all about you, you know. You're not here to just show off your YouTube skills and you're articulately able to sort of stumble your way through very fast speech and no one quite knows what you're talking about. But then we don't know whether it's postmodern and ironic. But you've done that video on the one before, the one about Wolfpack. You're not doing that. You're still in that zone, aren't you? You're just talking about this free association. Get your free association. You're in full go now. Come on, Andy, let's go. What have you got at number 10 on the list, your ranking list of the Miles Davis albums from the 80s? And what I've got is You're Under Arrest. Now, You're Under Arrest comes from that 1985 period, right in the middle of the 1980s. Actually, 1985 actually is right in the middle of the 1980s. I mean, it's all there for you. Anybody who's got basic math skills will be able to work this one out. And You're Under Arrest, well, I actually quite like it. Shall we move on? I mean, can you imagine if I just did them like that? I start off at number 10. I quite like this one, number 9. Quite like this one, number 8. I like this one more. And then we get to number 1. This is my favourite one. I like this one the most. Thank you for watching. Why have I got to talk about it? You don't want to know what I'm going to talk about, do you? You just want to hear the list. You want to get, what's that? You're sat here, go, get on with it. I might scoot to the end just to see what is. I mean, I do that with a lot of the Sea of Tranquility ones. Do you? You know, when he's you know, doing like someone with about 30 albums. And I start off with good intentions. I'm watching it and he's really good. Pete's really good. But it's not that he's bad. It's just my nosiness to know what he's put in the top 3 sort of takes over. And so I'm going to have to zip to the end and find out. And then once I've done at the end, it's like, oh, I didn't expect that. So where the hell did you put so-and-so? You know, where's he put like point of entry? Say if he was doing Judas Priest. You don't mention Judas Priest on a video about Miles Davis. You can see what's going on here, can't you? You're just trying to get on their nerves, aren't you? A little bit, you see. You're getting on their nerves, aren't you? You know your audience, right? There's some people, the proper Andy Edwards viewers, the ones who subscribe, they're enjoying this. They're sat it back because they're with you. Enjoy the fact that you're not doing the Miles Davis top 10 albums of all time. It's like a postmodern ranking video, isn't it? You're here. Are you ever going to do this? I mean, you just started then. You did number 10, You're Under Arrest. But why is number 10? Why is that number 10? You know, I mean, what you say that's better than? What I'm saying that's better than is Dingo and Siesta. That's what I'm saying it's better than. Well, why have you put those at the bottom? Because if I remember rightly, isn't You're Under Arrest the one that contains like Human Nature, the Michael Jackson cover, and Time After Time that he played endlessly live when he went out? And although that band was pretty funky live, I heard Human Nature a few more times too many. I don't know. And then hasn't he got loads of like bits of rappy bits and talking bits? Doesn't Sting turn up at some point, you know, proving that he can speak French a bit and speaking in French? You know, it's that album, isn't it? Well, let's get right into this properly now. All right. The 1980s is the postmodern era. This is where postmodernism is not quite formed. Okay, and one of the things that's interesting about postmodernism, when you have that revisionist look back, it can't quite deal with the 1980s because that's where it's forming, and it's all forming around about 1985. Now if you went back to 1985, it will be a much simpler time. Yes, this video is actually about the 1980s and Miles Davis and the cultural implications and the idea of postmodernism, which I am becoming much more comfortable with, and realizing that there's a lot of postmodern ideas on my channel, and that's what you're seeing here is a sort of postmodern ranking. So you're going, oh, I understand it. That bit at the start was like a postmodern. So you're trying to show why the 1980s albums aren't like, because they're at that point. So the 1970s albums, let's take Miles Davis, right? Let's just step back because the bloody ranking doesn't matter. I can whiz through that at the end of the video. In fact, shall I just put it right at the end of the video, the ranking, and then those who are like me watching Sea of Tranquility and just zip to the end, you could like a zip to the end, just get the ranking like that. You can come back now and stick it in the thing. Why didn't somebody, one of the small swatty ones, why don't you just go watch the video through for everybody else so they don't have to put up with this, write down what the list is, and then just put it in the comments, right? As soon as I see the first person do it, I will pin that comment. So most of you don't have to watch the video, but if you don't watch the video, can you please subscribe and put a like on? And if you appreciate the fact that I've let you in at 10 minutes, you go, oh, I don't have to bloody put all this, time into this, I can just bugger off now. Then if you appreciate that, put some money in the PayPal tip jar. And I can do that all the time. We could sit here, in fact, not telling anybody, not telling YouTube, let it play though, but just go off and do something else. I want the view, but why don't you just, we'll have a deal. I come out, I do the video, right? Top 10, somebody then puts it in the things, you read it there, you put your like, you subscribe, stick $1 into my PayPal tip jar so I can buy some food, and then bugger off. And we won't tell anybody. It's a bit like School of Rock, when they're pretending to do the lessons, but they're not really, they're just really having fun. You could go off and have some fun, couldn't you? Like actually listening to these albums, rather than listen to me talk about these albums. Why would you want to hear some middle-aged bloke in a dodgy waistcoat talking about Miles Davis albums? And he's not even talking about them. He's talking about something else. Now, what he's talking, he might think is very, very important, and he might feel that he's doing some sort of great cultural service to be able to, put into context these sort of postmodern ideas that have taken over our view of culture. And what do? What they do is they take an artist like Miles Davis, and there's a whole bunch of problems with Miles, because Miles is the birth of the cool, and postmodernism is about looking cool. So Miles Davis is the man. So Miles Davis will never be maligned. And even though these postmodernist type, they don't like the sexists and the racists and all these type of things, so they have a problem with Miles Davis because he was a bit of a misogynist. He's punching his wife in and doing all that. He's pimping out women and all that, taking loads of drugs, treating people badly. But he's also getting beaten up by the police, isn't he? He's exposing the racism in America. But then on the other side of it, he was already a very upper middle class American citizen before he got in there. And he could have just basked in privilege and comfort that his fellow black, Americans probably didn't have, that he did, and he didn't do much about that, did he? In fact, he pretended a little bit to be, the sort of street pimpy black guy, but actually if you listen to his trumpet playing, he was very sensitive, wasn't he, and very feminine in a way. And when he emerged in the early 50s, it was that femininity that could transform jazz standards like Someday My Prince Will Come or Round Midnight into a way that was very accessible for the sort of American middle classes at the time to appreciate. It was beautiful. He could transform the cheesy into the beautiful. Right? This is something that postmodernists do. You take something cheesy and you transfer it into something that's great art through your own gaze, your own postmodern gaze, just because you've said it is, right? This is what Miles Davis does in the 1950s. And he sells a lot of records and he becomes a very, very powerful jazz musician. He's not scratching anything like Thelonious Monk or any of those guys. He's selling a lot of records. By the time he gets to the late 50s, he makes Kind of Blue, which goes on to become the biggest selling jazz record in the 1950s. By the time he gets to Sketches to Spain with Gil Evans, his job's done. He is in the firmament of great jazz musicians. People love him. He has the right mix of accessibility and hostile danger. This is the whole thing about Miles. But Miles he's a searcher. He's a seeker. And as the 1960s come in, the music industry starts to change. He starts to change with it. And although he doesn't explore free jazz, he explores his own version of free jazz. And when people start mixing popular music and rock music, he explores his own way of doing that. And this moves him away from that cozy, accessible but hostile sound that the critics like. And they didn't like what he did in the early 70s. They just rejected it, and they said he was making pop music. But he wasn't making pop music. You know, Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson and Pangea and Agata and On the Corner and Get Up With It and Big Fun and all those albums were not pop albums. They were actually really, really difficult albums. And they were ahead of their time. And once you got to the 1980s, people like Bill Laswell and a few other musicians started to look back at those albums, and they start to go, no, these albums are really amazing. And now these albums are held up as being genius albums. But around this time, Miles, who I think had just painted himself into an aesthetic hole, couldn't hear the music anymore. He just stopped. And I know what that's like. That can happen. If you're an artist like Miles, and you're only going to pick up the trumpet when you're doing something new, when there doesn't seem to be anything new around you, you disappear. And Miles actually disappears at the beginnings of disco and punk. You don't think that's interesting? It's 75, he's gone. And he goes into some sort of self-imposed, you know, drug hell for about 6 years. He's secluded. In 1981, there's this big announcement that he's going to come back. You know, so he's coming back now. When he comes back, it's as though he's taken on whatever happened in that period that ends up in the change in the landscape of popular music, which goes from, this is mainstream popular music, it goes from being white artists, the great big artists of the early Led Zeppelins, and then, you know, the Barry Manilow's and all those people, and all the black music is the music for black people. We know this, you know, their list of Parliament, Funkadelic, maybe Earth, Wind and Fire, but then Earth, Wind and Fire start to have crossover hits. But by the time we get to 1981, MTV will not, you know, put a black person on their channel. And, you know, the first person to get up there was Herbie Hancock, you know, with Rockets. It's incredible, really, that that's what happened, because it was an instrumental track and because he wasn't featured in the video. Miles Davis drops into this arena, and in 81, we're seeing, and he's right at the beginning of it, the emergence of people like Prince and Michael Jackson, who he is going to champion throughout that decade. So I think Miles is spurred on and going, hang on, we now have mainstream popular black music as being the main popular music. And he always wanted to reach the people on the streets. Miles always did. And I don't think it was just because he wanted to be cool. I think he saw himself as a conduit for those people, right? And so when he comes back, to the casual listener, Miles is exploring much more popular music forms. As he starts to go through the 1980s, and we see the emergence of, I think the big ones would be Thriller by Michael Jackson and then Purple Rain by Prince. Right about 1985, he leaves CBS Records and he starts to explore stuff that's even more commercial. And he does this at the start by creating a band which gets known as the Rubber Band Band. Now, I thought this was a band, but it's not so much a band. It was a sound created by a production team, which was Randy Hall and Zane Gillette, I think, who had produced a track, which is the worst track on The Man with the Horn. He starts to explore this stuff. And then, I think once he's got his sound, he shelves that, gets Marcus Miller in, and he brings out Tutu. And Tutu was a big pop success with videos on MTV. He hit all the magazines. And this is where Miles Davis really becomes the legend, you know, the aesthetic touchstone. So I'll just get my list up. Now, You're Under Arrest is a good place to start because it's from that 1985 period. They still haven't got to Tutu, but he's turned his face away from the more exploratory jazz that you actually get on the early albums in the 1980s, which gets glossed over by the critics. And he starts to bring in these popular elements. So we see Miles Davis on the front looking sort of like an 80s pop star with a very touched up face, and he's sat there with a really trendy clothes and he's holding a toy gun, and it's all actually quite strange. And we don't know whether Miles is sort of trying to conform to that 80s aesthetic that you'd see, or whether he's actually been a bit postmodern and ironic and going like, here he is looking like the street pimp with the clothes, but he's holding this toy gun. And I always thought, you know, why didn't they get him a real gun? It would have been so much more powerful. And so you feel he's got the toy gun because he doesn't want to threaten anybody, but he wants it and he doesn't quite get there. But maybe that's the irony. And this is the whole, you know, subtext of this video is the postmodernism with which we can't quite deal, our postmodernist gaze looking at these albums. You're Under Arrest, however, in many places contains some burning fusion. And it also contains some really interesting sonic areas that Miles gets into, using sort of found sounds and like ambience. You hear like atomic bomb sounds going off, and there's narration, and I find that all really interesting. I find this album really interesting, and the band here, which has got Darryl Jones on bass, basically. I think we got, is it still Bob Berg at this point, or has he gone at that point? I think he's still here on this album, and John Scofield on guitar. And there's a certain sound which is sort of the iconic 80s fusion sound: slap bass, unison lines between guitar and sax, which are very bebop derived, very funky and tight, and lots of sort of punchy playing, with lots of DX7 and gated reverb when it gets bad. And so You're Under Arrest, I find, is actually when they just stop doing all the stuff, there's some really good playing in here. So basically, at number 10, every one of these albums I think is really, really good. And it comes from a period in jazz rock fusion where everybody had succumbed to the mainstream, and when a lot of people were really making sort of middle of the road GRP, jazz funk, Kenny G derived stuff. Everybody was doing it to some extent. And Miles gets roped in, but I don't think Miles is doing that here. I think Miles is exploring something, and what he's exploring is how what he did before, what he does, relates to this new popular music, which is much more focused in the 80s around black music approaches and technology. And You're Under Arrest is probably the best example of Miles going deep into this. And because of that, it does have a whole ton of 80s cheesiness, but it does have some incredible playing. Plus, we see the return of John McLaughlin, who at that point in 1985 was a bit lost, to be honest. No one ever says this. John's a bit lost in 1985. That Mahavishnu thing's sort of, not going well. He's trying to attempt to go down the 80s jazz rock fusion thing, and he's blending it out a little bit, although that band was better live. And he's played a lot of synclavier, so we could tell who he was on the albums. And he gets pulled in, picks up the electric guitar, and does some great playing with Miles. Sort of, it re-energizes him in a way, but he does then put the electric guitar away for quite a long time. So that's why I've got number 10, is You're Under Arrest, which is, I would say, is a really, really good album. All these albums are really good, and I think if you're a jazz fan and a Miles fan, you need to dip into them. At number 9, I do have the aforementioned Rubber Band album. Now, this was recorded around about 84, 85. These sessions were not put out. But then he changed his label, went from CBS to Warner Brothers. He hooked up with Tommy LaPuma, who had a production approach and just let him to do whatever he wants to do. And he goes to the studio, works on this for a while, then it never comes out. It's really overseen by his drummer at the time, Vince Wilburn Jr., who is actually his nephew. So there's a bit of nepotism going on. He's got his nephew in, and his nephew is working with these two producers, like I say, Zane Gillett, or Zane Gillett, I think his name is, and Randy Hall. Now, they actually did 2 tracks on the very first comeback album, The Man with the Horn, Shout and The Man with the Horn. And they are, even back then on the first album, they are bringing in a big pop sensibility. We'll talk about this when we get to The Man with the Horn, because another album I really want to talk about how great it is, because it really is great. So 30 years later, as the labels are scraping the barrel, they go, well, they're these Rubber Band sessions. And so they notified Randy Hall, and he goes, well, we'll put them out. And what he does is quite interesting, because some of these tracks were designed to be vocal tracks. So he was going to get Al Jarreau in on one, and he was going to get Shaka Khan in on the other. So they got these vocal tracks, but that never quite happened. So some of these tracks, when you listen to it, are not just straightforward mixes of this Rubber Band that existed in 1985. It's not that. And it's interesting when you put your ears in the mix, because this album splits down the middle. There's some very fiery, almost like 80s funkadelic tracks, which is the Rubber Band. And Bob Berg is on some of these. Mike Stern crops up. Now, if Mike Stern's on, we're actually going to some of these sessions, like tracks like The Maze, as being even earlier than the Rubber Band sessions. So they're pulling from a wider remit than just the Rubber Band sessions. And what's also interesting is, because that band with Vince Wilburn, had Robin Ford on guitar at one point, Bob Berg, who did they have on bass? Can't remember. But that band, when you go and check out the live stuff in the mid-80s, that's the band you hear, and they're doing tracks like Wrinkle. And at the time you're going, what's this Wrinkle? It's like the best Miles Davis track. What is it? The Wrinkle was a track from one of this session, the Rubber Band sessions. There was actually 5 tracks, including Rubber Band. You know, I can't remember the rest of them. That they were playing live. I saw Miles Davis live in 1990 with Kenny Garrett and Foley on guitar, and Benny Rietveld on bass, I think it was. They were playing this stuff, and we would go, well, I don't know what album this is from. So this stuff is really key. Listening to the album, you have some mixes of those tracks. They're very interesting, very 80s, but very funky and cool 80s. This is the thing, it's cool, funky stuff. Miles Davis is pushing it on here. He's exploring loads. He's taking the language of 80s, sort of that sort of Janet Jackson sort of 80s sound, and he's applying jazz to it. Then we have the vocal tracks, and the vocal tracks and a few of the other tracks on here have been really produced, and they do not sound like they're from the 80s. They have all the modern production that you would expect. So this is not, those don't feel like a Miles Davis album. It feels like they've taken some Miles Davis and made new tracks out of it. They bring in brilliant singers like Ledesi, jazz singer, and Layla Hathaway. And these stuff I liked, so I really liked the vocal stuff. It was really contemporary, jazzy, funky stuff, but with Miles Davis playing trumpet on. And the other thing I've got to say about this, on the track, I think it's The Maze, there's some astonishing trumpet playing from Miles. Miles has a way of playing, which is basically how I want to play. When I solo, I want to just be able to play what I want to play. I don't want to play any jazz licks. I don't want to go through the chord changes, and consider the changes. I'm very influenced by Ornette Coleman. And of course, Ornette Coleman at this time was doing Prime Time, which sounds very similar in a way to what Miles is doing on these sessions. But Miles has his own Ornette Coleman way of, and it's influenced me so much. You can understand, when I learned to play guitar, I would put Miles Davis albums, I would just copy his licks, because he always put a space in. He'd put a space, he'd play something, and in that space I would go, what's that? And I would learn to get these licks because I thought they sounded amazing. And there's moments on this where he's playing, he's astonishing, but it's not what you expect jazz musicians to do. And I imagine the jazz world are a little bit like, oh, I don't quite get what Miles is doing. I mean, it sounds a bit rubbish. It's not like in the 1950s when he played. It's all got squeaks and sound and slurs. He does go back to early jazz. He's using the trumpet to create all these different sounds, and he's also playing very chromatically and inside the notes. So the way he weaves through it, to me, is absolutely astonishing. So this Rubber Band album is really amazing, but it's a strange listen, which is why it's so low on the list here. It's because it is patched together after the fact. But for us Miles Davis fans, it does give us a real good idea of what was going on in between the early stuff and the later stuff, right? At number 8, I have the double live album, Live Around the World, which captures that post-1985 band playing. Now, at the time, when albums like Tutu and Amandla were coming out, which were very heavily processed in the studio and didn't really have a band, they had more just guests on there. If you went to see Miles live, and I saw him on the TV, I also saw him live in person, this band was pretty incredible, very fiery. When Kenny Garrett joined, Kenny Garrett being sort of the alto saxophone player of the 1980s, an absolutely incredible voice and a fiery player. All this stuff, the only way you could get it was by going for this live album. So for many years, I felt that this live album was the best of the later Miles Davis, because there's more soloing, more playing on it. And because it's been captured all over the place, it feels epic, and you feel that Miles Davis is striding across the world, playing in all these different places, playing really high-end jazz. Foley on his sort of lead bass is incredible. He's got a great band. It's funky, it's tight, and I think that's a great album. But I have actually rated the albums that came out at that time higher, and at number 7, I've got Amandla. Now, Amandla was the follow-up to Tutu, his big sort of album of the 1980s. And Amandla is a little bit more band orientated. It's a little bit less studio-y and produced. It has got Kenny Garrett on it this time and some of those musicians. it's got really beautiful playing, like Mr. Pastoris, which was a tribute to Jacko, who had died in 1987. Beautiful ballads on there, incredible playing, and very tight 80s funky stuff. Now, I am an aficionado of 80s funky stuff, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff I love. If I was to put on, say, Sign of the Times by Prince, it's incredible funky stuff, and I love the funk. But great 80s funk is few and far between, right? I'm not so keen on electro funk, and definitely not the sort of R&B, sort of big gated sounds that you found on albums by, I don't know, Lionel Richie or Shaka Khan at that time. Although I love it, I Feel For You by Shaka Khan. So if you listen to I Feel For You by Shaka Khan, which is one of my favourite albums of all time, I grew up listening to it, I absolutely love it. That sort of a production approach, which is what you get on these mid-80s albums. So you have to bear that in mind. That sort of jazz improvisation feel thing isn't so much there. But it's interesting seeing it in the context of Miles is not interested in us jazz fans liking it. He's trying to get a hit record. He's a millionaire. I don't think he's bothered about the money. He's more, I think, bothered about his representation. And he wants the labels to be putting him in front of the kids still. I think that's what it is, because he wants to reach the kids. That's what he wants. But a mandler is not that. It's heavier than that. But it's like all the tracks are sort of 3 or 4 minutes long. It's sort of pop music set out in that way. It's sort of almost caught between two posts, which I don't think 2-2 is. And we'll get to that as we get up, because obviously 2-2 is above this. At number 6, I have The Man with the Horn, which came out, I think it was made in 1980, came out in 81, and was the big comeback album, right? Now, when I bought this album, this was one of the first Miles Davis albums I ever bought, okay? I can remember taking it home and I put the first track on and Fat Time comes on. Mike Stern, and this is the first time he played with Miles Davis, literally that recording is that he's just walked into the studio and he's playing on this track and they don't really know what they're doing because it's a Miles Davis album, they're jamming some grooves. And then, I think Miles says, take a solo. He called him Fat Time because he was a bit of a fatty back then, not anymore, but he was then. So Miles turns around to him and says, do you do a solo? And Mike Stern does at that point what I think is perhaps the greatest guitar solo in the history of mankind. I've said it so. I mean, when I rank the greatest, it's either this or Devil Take the Hindmost by Alan Holdsworth. And that one's, Holdsworth is so beautiful and panoramic and just virtuoso and beyond. He's like God playing the guitar. Mike Stern on here, you've got all those jazz licks, but it's chaotic and frenetic and wild. He really was a wild player back then. Fat Time's incredible. So this came on and I was like blown away by this guitar solo. And the rest of the album didn't have him on. I didn't realise that because I didn't have the liner notes, but I now know the rest of the playing was by a guitarist called Barry Finnerty that played with the Brecker brothers. Now, Barry Finnerty is a great jazz guitarist, but he never, ever takes a solo on here. And if you want a little bit of a fact as well, his father, Warren Finnerty, is he plays that rancher in Easy Rider that takes a shine to Peter Fonda. He's also in Cool Hand Luke, which I found very interesting when I read that this morning. Anyway, let's carry on. So I didn't know what to make of this album. And then on here is a ballad called The Man with the Horn. And it's one of those Randy Hall productions who went on to do the rubber band stuff. And it's like a very sort of slick Lionel Richie type ballad. And it's about Miles Davis as well. And it's always strange, if I was going to put an Andy Edwards album out and I got some producers in that went, and he is the man, he plays the drums and he also talks on YouTube. He's the man, he's the man, he's the man with a YouTube. When you've got a song like that in your own album, it either makes you feel, what's Miles Davis got to do with this then? How can you do this? Everyone's sucking up to Miles. And I don't know. So I hated that tune, right? I went back and listened to it a couple of days ago for this video. It's unbelievable. It's The Man with the Horn is incredible. And Backseat Betty and Aida and Ursula, these tracks are incredible. There's another much more almost like Brecker Brothers funky track called Shout that I think Randy Hall's also produced. That's great. And I've got to be honest, even The Man with the Horn is The Man with the Horn. There's a Freudian slip there. The Man with the Horn is great too. And what goes through all this album that I never picked up at the time is the incredible production. It's in this big echoey room, or it sounds like this, and it's got a sound which is not the 1980s, and it's not the 1970s either. It's got this big, expansive, ringy sound. On the Ursula track, and you got to remember, Miles Davis was always, he's bringing all these pop music things in. Ursula is one of the first sort of swinging time no changes tunes that I think Miles has done since the 1960s. Bill Evans on saxophone is just unbelievable on here. He's more than deserves his place in this band, and he's playing as out there as Miles, and Miles is playing he's out there. This album is absolutely brilliant, and all the way through it is the funky bass playing of Marcus Miller that seems to have one foot firmly into this new slap sound that's going to take over fusion, but also has the jazz chops to be able to pull off some of the stuff on this here. So Man with the Horn, so my computer keeps shutting down the picture so I can't see my list. The Man with the Horn is just utterly fantastic, and I would say from this point on, these next 6 albums are masterpieces, you know. And the Man with the Horn, go and check it out. The follow-up to the Man with the Horn was an album called Star People that still goes into this sort of quite echoey big production sound, not the 80s echo, not gated reverb, but it's got that sound. And Miles worked with Gil Evans on this album, and Gil Evans orchestrated and arranged it. And Star People, again, is absolutely incredible because this early band is so fiery. On this album, you've not only got Mike Stern, but you've also got John Schofield, you've got Marcus Miller on bass, but he departs, we get Tom Barney. And what we have on here is some really fiery, funky playing. And if you listen to the opening track, which I'm afraid I can't remember the name of it, which is unbelievable, and you listen to what's going on that track, and listen to the interplay between the bass and Mike Stern on guitar, there's things going on there which you don't often hear in 80s jazz rock fusion. There's also these long, beautiful blues. There is quite a bit of Miles's keyboard playing on here, which is an acquired taste. Not so much because he plays these incredible chords, but he does have this very 80s DX7 sound. But I think that keyboard was often acting more as a sort of centre in this music than his trumpet was. On albums like Bitches Brew, it's the trumpets that's directing the music, but he seems to direct the band with these chords. You know, they get into a certain place, and because Miles is so forward-looking, you always feel like he's wrangling his musicians towards doing something that's unique and not falling back on cliches. And when they do start to fall back on cliches, he then sticks a chord in, which all seems to upset the apple cart. When I saw him live in 1980, I can remember the keyboard player taking a solo, and in the middle of this solo, Miles just upended his trumpet and into the microphone and said, "Why do you have to play so goddamn loud?" And the trumpet player then stopped, and the band all looked around, and then he walked around a bit, and then he pointed for someone else, and then they came in with the trepidation, go, "Well, I better not play loud." I mean, the guy wasn't playing loud, he was just soloing. So this is what's going on these albums, and they're as heavy as anything he ever did. Okay, at number 4 I have Decoy, which is the follow-up to Star People. So you can see as these albums come out, Man with the Horn, Star People and Decoy, he's building all the time until this band stops, and then he forms the rubber band. Decoy is also right on the crossover. We've got John Schofield on guitar, and very interestingly, we've got Branford Marsalis on saxophone on some of these, who plays incredibly. And this is the time when Winton had emerged, and Winton has sort of faced off Miles a little bit. You know, Miles was the old guy, but looking towards the future, and Winton was the young guy, but looking towards the past, and there was a big standoff. As Branford didn't get caught up in this, he's playing with Sting, and he's going out and playing all sorts. He's got his Buckshot LaFunk thing, so he's not scared of fusion, he'll play it. And he turns up on a Miles Davis album. I love the production on here. It's tight and funky. It really goes into an 80s aesthetic, which I think still sounds fresh, because there's a lot of 80s music still sounds fresh to this day. And I think Decoy is an incredible album. Above that, at number 3, I do have Tutu. Now, if I was listening to the jazz, if I wanted to listen to the jazz, I'd listen to Decoy. But Tutu is Miles's great achievement, and this has to be considered when you make a list like this. I think if you're a jazz fan, even if you don't like this album very much, you have to own a copy of it. It's the 80s jazz rock fusion album, or jazz fusion album, or whatever you want to call it. When he decided the rubber band sessions weren't going in the right direction, He sits down with Tommy LaPuma and they bring in Marcus Miller back in, who's now doing a lot of production. And Marcus Miller basically creates this album, which is a lot more programmed, a lot more using all the technology at the disposal in the middle of the 80s, a lot more sampling, a lot more sequencing, a lot of chains of effects, lots of reverb and gated reverb and chorus and all those sort of things. He assembles a pretty stellar lineup. I think you got George Duke at one point, turns up on keyboards. And who's the violinist that comes in at one point? Not Didier Lockwood, it's not him. Oh, Andy. I know exactly who it is. But when you do these videos, sometimes you can't recall it, but I'm sure they will put it into there, and I'll probably remember it once I stop. You know, when you stop thinking about it and then you remember it. Anyway, there's some incredible stuff. In fact, that violinist, who I can't remember his name, his solo is unbelievable. You can tell he's been pulled in to play the Miles Davis album. He goes, I'm going to give it my best, and he bloody does. It's incredible. So there are some great solos, and the solos are short and pithy. And solos that are short and pithy, if you're a musician, listen to them, because you learn something. Listen to those, as well as the sort of long open-ended solos. When Tutu came out, it was accompanied with a big hoo-ha. You know, Miles was on the cover of all the magazines. He suddenly became this sort of commercial entity. He started cropping up in like Miami Vice, and he was in like Scrooged. He was in mainstream films. He's on chat shows. He's on MTV. He's on the cover of every single magazine. And even though the bloke was like, how old was he at this point? 60 years old. You see, it's incredible. Miles, when he did Tutu, was basically 3 years older than me. That's incredible. But back then, he was this old man of jazz. He was a relic of that period. But Miles was always, and this is something that no one ever talks, Miles, like Elvis Presley, is one of the most beautiful men. His face is incredible, and it stayed. So even when he was ill, the intense look of, he is, whatever James Dean represents, Miles Davis actually was it. And I can remember, you know, when you look at that iconic Tutu album cover and you see Miles Davis is on the front, and then you turn it over and he's done that thing where he's stretched his face up like that. It's just so iconic. This album is just so iconic, and it represents the fact that in the 1980s, Miles came back, had this comeback, and he works to this point where he does produce the jazz-related album of the 1980s. It's the album. I'd love to know how much it sold, because I think it sold well, and it proved that he could still do it. And the jazz world didn't like it because it was commercial, right? And Miles Davis didn't care. And there's something to be really learnt looking back with our postmodernist eyes. And also, it sounds amazing. All the 80s production, Marcus Miller got it right. It sounds amazing. You know, on that first track that opens up, which is called Tutu, and you can picture Miles walk, you can picture that slow walk, and it's so cool. It's a great album, and I do love Tutu. What have we got a number 2 above that? It's We Want Miles. So that first period with Mike Stern on guitar, when it's a lot more jazzy, a lot more solo-y, a lot more freer, a lot more, you know, all this stuff going on. If you want the exemplary album of that period, great as Man with the Horn is, great as Star People is, great as Decoy is, and all these albums that happened at that point, it's We Want Miles. And We Want Miles was recorded in 1981. It's this comeback band going out and playing live. Miles Davis, you can tell, is a little bit weak on this. He's still playing great. I actually enjoy that. Miles can never play badly for me. Because he's a bit like Billie Holiday at this point. He can't play like he did on Milestones, but you hear a distillation in the soloing of what soloing is really about. And if you listen to that, especially a musician like me that got so into like playing lots of notes and playing fast, I need that. But he often, when he plays in that manner, it's because he's got stellar soloists that are going to come out and do all that thing, and he's going to act as the counteract balance. When he hasn't got someone like that in the band, he'll often take that place himself. And that's what you have on here. And with Bill Evans, Mike Stern, and Marcus Miller, they're just playing out of themselves. You know, they're young, they're fiery. You've got the great Al Foster on drums, and Al Foster is a proper jazz drummer who not only is being told to play funk grooves, which he can do to the cows come home, but he's also been ordered by Miles Davis to keep the hi-hats open like it's a heavy metal band. And there's moments, say the intro to Backseat Betty. Did I call it Black Betty early on? Backseat Betty. You could hear there's almost sort of a heavy metal aspect to this. Mike Sturdy's off the charts. His guitar sound, the way he plays, is just ridiculous. We Want Miles is I think really is the great, from a jazz point of view, is the great album from the 1980s. But there's one album I've got at number one. And that album is not really a Miles Davis album. And I thought, shall I put it on or shan't I? And it's actually from 1989. And it's called Aura. And Miles plays on it and plays incredible. It's a double album, the double studio album. It's one of the greatest double albums I can think of in jazz, actually. It's one of the greatest jazz albums of the 1980s, one of the greatest jazz albums of the last 40 or 50 years. Miles was given a prize, I think it was the Sonic Jazz Prize, I'm not too sure. And so in honour of this, a piece was composed which sort of looked at Miles's career, not in a sort of we're going to do that, but just taking influences like that and seeing that as the all the different colours in Miles's aura. It was made 2 years before he died. As he was approaching death, he did the Quincy Jones albums, you know, those albums that he suddenly started to look back. I mean, the greatest achievement at this point was the DVD Live in Paris, where everyone comes back. It's so emotional and so incredible. And you've got like John McLaughlin's there, Joe Zawinul's there, Wayne Shorter's there, you know. It's just such an incredible, Dave Holland, they all come back and honour Miles. But if you actually want to hear the creative honour, the sort of almost like the crown, the summit of Miles's career, the sort of it's this album Aura. I can't explain how great it is. Each track is a colour, right? And it takes numbers. It takes number system. It's very European. It's very organised. It's somewhere between the street cool, you know, sort of wanting to be commercial sound that Miles was looking at, but also sort of European, almost like ECM compositional approach. They use Simmons drums on here. John McLaughlin comes back here and just plays fiery stuff. You got Niels Pedeston playing incredible double bass on here. The lineup's very interesting. It's not Miles's normal one. This is the anomaly in Miles's career. I would possibly put this in the top 5 albums. If I was going to put 5 Miles Davis albums, what would they be? Kind of Blue, In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, that's 3. What else would you have? One of the quintets, I suppose. Which one would that be? I'd probably go for Miles Smiles. And then when we look at the 80s period, what are we going to go for? It's Aura. And Aura encapsulates the whole lot. So Aura is an incredible album. That's what I've got at number 1. So there is a subtext to this video. What it is that on Saturday I put a video out where I was chatting with 2 philosophers, Brendan LeVar and John Phillips, Dr. Brendan and Dr. John, and it's changed my view of postmodernism. And I have been considering the way I use postmodernism on this channel and some of the stuff I do that I know sets my channel apart from other people who do ranking videos. And it's an attempt for me to either be a pretentious asshole or, and I don't know which one it is, or try and explore some of the cultural things that make videos like this a little bit more palatable. So rather than just having a list of what I like and I don't like, to actually consider the fact that Miles Davis is a 20th century icon. He sort of embodies the postmodern period, you know. If you think of Jean-Paul Sartre or French New Wave film or Derrida or Foucault, if you had all those people, you could stick Miles Davis in there and he would make sense. So he is the great postmodernist icon in a way. He's not the entertainer that Louis Armstrong is, which embodies the sort of good, honest, sort of straight down the line, let's just make entertainment and make it great, you know, modernist idea of art. It embodies a sort of anti-art, anti-hero. That's what Miles is. And he's not just reflecting that, he's actually part of the system that creates that idea. So when you go through his career, when he starts to flirt with these street pop music things, the critics at the time can never deal with it. And this actually puts Miles Davis always into the future. So all the 70s albums now, which when I was a kid, it was like, I can remember reading the thing and it said, oh, you know, Miles, there was a documentary on Miles and it said, Miles in 1975 no longer could hear the music, and at the time it showed them playing live with the wah-wah pedal and the big glasses and the flares, as though this music had just sort of he'd lost his way in the 70s on Agatha and Pangaea and On the Corner. That was the take, but the postmodernist lens looks back at them and starts to see something in there, and what it sees is this sort of Afro-futuristic sort of ambient drum and bass dance music sort of crossover thing that Sun Ra also got in the 1980s and the 1990s. That sort of looking back, going, this is really important to what's happening in hip hop and blah 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 and all that type of stuff. But the 80s stuff, because it comes from that period. 1985, I think, is the point where Miles, that doesn't matter how postmodern and ironic the critics get, they just can't quite stomach Miles Davis making 80s pop. If I was to come out here and say that you know, Our Love Is History, or it's just called History by Mai Tai, which is another brilliant sort of black R&B, soul, funky tune from the mid-80s, and I love it. I love that tune so much. If I said that, I think that's a great work of art. All the postmodernists would nod and go, yes, we really love that. And it's to do with the fact that that is still an attempt to just be pop music. It's not knowing, but the postmodernists, they want Miles to be knowing, right? So they were much more comfortable with the sort of postmodernist gaze of Winton, looking back and sort of emulating the idea it's 1962, we've all got suits on and we're all playing into microphones, we're playing hard bop, and this is a great art form and we can appreciate it with our backwards gaze now and understand it and see how it was a fight, you know, of the Afro-Americans for freedom and all that type of thing that emerges in the 1980s. And Miles is just not fitting into that. He seems like an old bloke that wants to be Michael Jackson. Whereas I actually think that Miles was doing something to jazz which was as challenging to jazz as everything he ever made throughout his whole life. And so challenging that the jazz world still has a problem with these albums. And if you go back to them and listen to them, right, whatever you think of the 80s production, all the DX7s and gated reverbs and Simmons drums, right, whatever you think about that, listen to his playing. And if you feel that, oh, he's a bit past his prime, you know, he doesn't seem to have the strength and blah, 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 right, and all that, I think you're wrong. The Miles Davis I grew up with listening to, the Miles Davis that I know, is the Miles Davis on these albums. I have every single album from the 1980s and the 1990s in my collection, except for those two soundtrack albums, which I did have at one point and I didn't ever listen to them. So I had Siesta. I didn't have Dingo. And they're good albums. They are really good albums. But on the whole, I've got every single album. I've got most of the 70s albums, but not a lot of the bootleg ones that come out since then. My Miles is the 1980s Miles. That's the fact. I know these albums inside out and I absolutely love them. And I think if I stopped being all postmodern and ironic and tried to do some deep cultural, you know, evaluation of these albums, I would say when I was coming up and I got interested in jazz and I started to buy those albums, they were available. My local record shop would have whatever the latest Miles Davis album was, so I would buy it. And I'd take it home and I listened to it. And me, in my naivety, got a lot from these albums. A lot. That's all I can say. If I take the veneer of this sort of postmodern, this sort of art critic sort of thing that I was trained in when I was at art college, this way of evaluating art, and, you know, because this is what arty types do, you know, they evaluate art, you know, and this is, I love it and I think it's exciting. But in reality, if I tell you the truth, I just thought these were kicking albums at the time. It was great. Better than bloody that Hot House Flowers album. I can remember buying that by Winton around about the same time. Went and buy that, and God, it was like bloody awful. I mean, brilliantly played, beautifully. It was just him playing pretty, you know, pretty jazz standards with an orchestra. He want bloody Sketches Spain or Miles Ahead. I don't know. This is the big thing that you go back to. Whose side are you on? In 1985, whose side are you on? Winton's or Miles? here I am. This video has been inspired entirely by Jason Marsalis putting up that thing about on the corner. But at the time, if those two camps were two camps, and they were, I was in Camp Miles. All right, we're done. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, like it. If you want to subscribe, please subscribe. I have a Patreon. There's all the links down below that you can click on. I don't know whether me saying this at the end of the video makes any difference to this whatsoever. You know, there's a whole bunch of links down there. If you want to support me, you can support me on Patreon. I got PayPal tip jar and all that's down there. All of that bit's there. So and I probably shouldn't be saying this because I've actually created some little adverts that I'm going to stick into the videos that are edited that tell you all this to remind you to do all that. Like a proper YouTuber. It's all about being proper. It's not about being post-modern. It's all about being proper and the good little capitalists that we all should be. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video. But I just wanted to tell you about a few ways that you can support me here on YouTube and get access to even more weirder and wackier content. First of all, you could become a patron. You could become a free member or a paid up member. I have over 300 extra videos on there. And if you don't even want to become a member, please pop over, because you can access my collections where you can purchase even more weirder and wackier video content. If you want to support me financially with a little tip, buy me some biscuits or maybe some crisps, you could pop over to my PayPal tip jar. I also have a Substack where I have lots of clever, academic and thought out articles where I explain my ideas on art, culture and creativity in a more intelligent way than I do here, plus a whole ton of podcasts. If you want to know what my music sounds like, you can pop over to my Bandcamp. Over there, you'll be able to listen to over 50 albums, and if you want to access them all, you could become a subscriber. And last but not least, if you want to support the wonderful studio where I film these lovely videos, which is actually a charity trying to help people out in the community become more creative, here is the website where you could drop a few pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in your country in there. Thanks for listening.